as we get going, welcome back. Now, there's a mistake on the document in front of you. And it's a repeated mistake because the date's wrong again. It's supposed to automatically update, but I haven't clicked the right box. So this is obviously the 29th of November. And then we had one that was really the 8th of November and one that was the 15th of November, and now we've got the 29th. But I have corrected it on the permanent copy, but I'd already printed these when I noticed it. So, and we are not following the curriculum plan tonight. Yeah, I know you got to go. I'm sorry. But the oh, okay. Why are we not following the plan? Well, it's based on some feedback I've gotten from a number of class participants that would indicate that we're still kind of spinning a few wheels about the shift we made. To review briefly, we started out and we spent some time talking about methodology, right? What I call first principles in logic and first principles in classical metaphysics. Could you shoot that down towards Marianne? Thank you. And so we talked about what I will refer to interchangeably as Aristotelian metaphysics or classical metaphysics. When I use the word classical, capital C, we're talking sort of like ancient Greek and Roman thinking. When we say scholastic, capital S, we're referring to classical metaphysics as developed and refined by medieval philosophers and theologians like Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, others. As we saw in last week's, or not last week's, but our last class, we saw that during that era, scholastic philosophers started becoming more what we would call nominalist or conceptualist philosophers. And the salient example was William of Ockham, right? Now, to review briefly, since we're still in the midst of how things are changing here, what tonight we're going to do is actually spend less time talking about philosophy per se and more time talking about the history of thought. Because we're sitting here in the 20th century and there are a lot of things that changed very radically that we take for granted. It's just the way the world works. So we're going to see where that came from a little bit so that when we do finally shift gears and go into what I call skepticism and materialism, we'll know that the background noise is not just noise. Okay? Fair enough? So, really quickly, what do I mean when I say a realist viewpoint, worldview, realist philosophy, capital R? Okay, so whether we talk about forms or ideas or whether we talk about universals, let's just use that as a catch-all term, that they're real things. And so if there is a universal that we call red or redness, there's a thing that's and anything that's red is red to the extent that it participates in redness. Any person is a human being to the extent that he or she participates in the real thing that we call humanity, humankind, mankind, whatever, however you want to play with that language. So realism would say that reality, the world, is defined by these real things, whereas, and there are all kinds of different positions within realism. We have Plato arguing that these are ideas and they're eternal forms, and they are in a third realm between the material realm and the spiritual realm. There's some other third realm out there, and things are read to the extent that, red participates in something becoming physical. We talked about the difference between actuality and potentiality, and how in the four formal causes, formal causation, we have to move from how something is a cause in terms of its material cause, what it's made out of, its efficient cause, who made it, its formal cause, what are the design elements, which posits the possibility of a designer, and its final cause in terms of whether something has a purpose or an end, telos in Greek. So there are all kinds of different ways to look at realism there, but basically they'd all say that the universe is defined with reference to real things that exist independent of how they are actualized in an individual thing. Fair enough? Nominalism, as opposed to that, it starts growing up during the medieval scholastic period. It says, no, there are no real things. Things are just what we call them. And it's an exercise in language and thought, and it requires the participation of a mind, but what you call it might be different from what I call it, and so there's no universal thing like that. I call this book or binder. I call this paper, but Michelle calls it jasper. And it's a jasper to her, and things are made out, you get jasper airplanes, and to Elizabeth, they're Elliott airplanes, and you get into all kinds of arguments about what is real, or is it just how she perceives things, how Carl perceives things. The only difference between nominalism per se and conceptualism is conceptualism says, well, behind all of these Jaspers and Elliots and papers, there is a thing that's paper. And we're getting close to something that looks like a universal, but it's still a construct of language and how our minds are going to engage with that. And then we take all of that and we blow it up with William of Ockham, who basically takes a conceptualist position and says that, there are no real things, but we're going to think about them this way and say how things are constructed by mind. Now, all that background takes us to the first slide here, which is we're shifting gears into modern philosophy. Modern, capital M. Doesn't mean contemporary. It means when we talk about the modern period, we're talking about post-Protestant Reformation. So 17th century, basically. And modernism is going to last well into the 20th century. And by the second half of the 20th century, we're going to start seeing postmodernism. Now, there are all kinds of different forms of modernism. We're going to see empiricism. We're going to see all these other, schools of philosophy. But I'm talking about a period of thought now. And what happens in the modern period is that classical metaphysics, that idea of real things and formal causation, is rejected, okay? Things don't have purposes. But they are rejected by the early moderns in a way that we have to go back and look at. Because when the moderns reject what they take to be the scholastic system, they're not actually engaging with the scholastic system as most fully articulated by St. Thomas Aquinas. They're dealing with a caricature of the scholastic system that has been brought about by William of Ockham's sort of conceptualist way of looking at things. So if you look at the Summa Theologiae by Thomas Aquinas, which is about that thick, or the Summa Contra Gentiles, which is about that thick, and look at his method of posing a question and then looking at every possible objection, the moderns are going to look at that way of doing philosophy and make a joke out of it and basically say this is arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Now, when you want to use the example of arguing about nothing, That's a pretty popular one, isn't it? How many angels can dance on the head of a pin, right? And that's actually a real example from early modern thinking, making a joke about scholasticism. Okay? Here's the problem. Because of the nominalist or conceptualist influences, the technical vocabulary of scholasticism became basically corrupted to be understood as describing subjective ideas as opposed to objective realities. And so we're all just arguing words. We're not talking about reality, we're talking about different people's perception of reality, which is not what scholasticism is actually doing. Scholasticism is seeking to embody classical metaphysics. The problem basically is that the terminology of classical metaphysics is really complicated, right? We've seen that. We've talked about actuality, potentiality, material, efficient, formal, and final causes, and there are like 10 different grades in each thing that you have to argue about how things work, and no potential can actualize itself and all that. It's complicated stuff. There's a reason why it's complicated. Why? Because reality is complicated. And so the classical metaphysics uses complicated terminology to describe something that isn't simple. And the moderns sort of revolt against that. They want to say it's got to be simpler than this. And people are arguing about angels on the head of a pin. And these are just word fights. And so once you reject that realist perspective and say that this is about words, then it becomes mere words and hair splitting, right? Once you reject the system, it's just arguments of words. It's hair splitting. But that means you've rejected the system without really engaging the real system. So, the moderns were not rejecting a system they understood, but a system they did not understand. That's why they never really engaged the arguments of Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. They just reject the arguments. That can't be right. They never really engaged with the arguments. So, where this rejection of classical metaphysics relates to perception, to how we look at things, I've underlined it for you. It's the issue of human agency. Who's in charge? Now, this is where the history of the development of thought gets important. Because we get, at the same time that human agency comes to the fore, we get people looking at what are we going to define as science. So we have Francis Bacon basically saying, let's have a new kind of science, which will allow us mastery over nature. He calls it the mechanical arts. We'd now call it technology. And so his aim is to develop stuff that allows us to control nature. Whereas classically, science was to say, how do we understand how nature works? How do we discern, the will of the deity, however we call the deity, and figure out how to align ourselves with this? That's science. Francis Bacon's new science is, how do we control the world around us and impose our will on it? You notice what just happened there? Who's in charge? We are, okay? Couple that with the fact that in this new science, what you're focused on is cause and effect, right? How X may relate to Y. But none of that addresses causation as such, whether it's real or not. You're not sitting there saying, there can't be such a thing as material and efficient and formal and final cause. You're just saying, I'm not looking at that problem. I'm looking at what caused this, whatever this is. this phenomenon, this thing? What was the antecedent cause on that? Which is why when moderns get into arguments about causation, they get hung up on the whole idea that there's an infinite regression because they're looking for cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, which is not what classical metaphysics is talking about in terms of causation, right? I see a few nods, but a lot of like, huh? So shout out questions here, okay? Because I'm compressing a lot of stuff. And then we throw into the mix the Protestant Reformation. Now, I'm not taking a doctrinal position here, okay? We're just talking about the way we look at reality. So, the Protestant Reformation basically takes William of Ockham and runs with him and says that, human agency is important here, and individual human will is what is most important in matters of faith. So we get Luther challenging ecclesiastical authority, which he associates with the scholastic system. And he views the scholastic system as unbiblical philosophy. And he says we need to focus on the primacy of individual conscience and how I live and experience my faith in Jesus Christ as my Savior. Okay? Again, this is a caricature here, but I'm sketching it out, and then we'll come back and talk about it more. At the same time, Luther and Henry VIII's defense of divorce inaugurates a revolution in social standards. And so while people are talking about human will, at the same time they're saying, and here's how you get to express your human will. Nobody can tell you you can't do this, and I'm just using the example of divorce here. And then we get Calvin, who starts, and in the Institutes of Religion, he's going to praise things like industry, thrift, and acquisition as Christian virtues. This is where we get the Protestant work ethic, right? These become virtues, whereas traditionally in church teaching, they were considered very suspect. You're not supposed to accumulate wealth. That's not a Christian position to take. So the net result of this is that philosophy, thinking about how we're supposed to live, becomes more focused on this world. Not on how all the spheres are turning about and how the universe works from a first cause, but what am I supposed to do? How are we in charge? How do we live our lives to the fullest? Because of these developments in theology, and equally because of a lot of political developments that are going on, Christianity fragments into hostile camps, and there's resulting conflict. A lot of it's bloody. This gives rise to an association of religious certainty with social unrest. It's kind of like the Rodney King standard back during the LA riots. Can't we all just get along? And so people want to say, can't we all just get along, rather than you're saying that there's truth in this and you're disagreeing, and so you're going to fight each other. Right? Right. Okay. Right. 2 out of 3, maybe. They're competing narratives, and and everybody appeals to the Bible for authority. Faith becomes more an act of will than how we think about things. And so put this mix together, and you start seeing how the moderns start thinking of faith as something that is somehow disconnected from reason, not founded on reason, not incorporating reason, but distinct from reason. The net result is that the moderns, not surprisingly, who have no experience of the classical pursuit of wisdom and learning for their own sakes, and have rejected the medieval scholastic application of ancient learning to the claims of faith, they come to focus elsewhere. And where they focus on page 2 is humanity's lot in this life and how to improve it, and a generalized skepticism of religious claims that if we have a generalized skepticism of religious claims, we'll have less conflict. Let's all just get along and not say that things are certain. And here's where John Locke enters the picture. But before John Locke enters the picture, let's breathe and say, covered a lot of ground there. Questions, comments, challenges. Tom.
Okay, so you said that the rejection of the scholastic was because people didn't understand scholasticism. Is there any way to understand it and reject it? Or do we have to buy into the premises we go through this that the only way to reject it is to not understand it?
That's a fair question. And you can reject scholasticism while understanding it. But that doesn't mean that you have constructed a different system that works in the same rational way. And so, as we'll see with John Locke, he'll say, okay, what you're basically saying is our first principles of logic, part of scholasticism, or let's call it classical metaphysics rather than scholasticism, because that has a little doctrinal baggage around it. Once we reject Aristotle, let's say, can we come up with another thought system that holds together and explains the phenomena we observe in life in ways that an Aristotelian viewpoint can't refute? I would say no.
So the method that he used is not, it's not good enough to reject himself.
Yeah. Now, you can challenge me on that, but we're going to have to do a lot more study, and we're going to have to get into some...
I'm just seeing if there's a way that you can look at this, if other people can look at this, and say, well, maybe they took a different route philosophically, rather than just saying, they didn't get it, just do it. I don't know the answer.
And people have tried that at least since the 16th century. Well, if we go back to Occam, at least since the 12th century. And broadly speaking, what you can say is, whether we argue about the terminology of Aristotle or Aquinas or somebody else, we can either say that some form of realism describes reality, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then we're stuck in some form of nominalism, whether we call that conceptualism or something else, which says we don't actually get to define how realism works. We just get to describe it. And we're all going to describe it differently. And so there's my reality and your reality, my truth and your truth. And it becomes much more subjective rather than objective, external to the human mind. So, for example, if I were to have red-green color blindness, I would perceive red differently from you if you had normal color vision. A realist perspective on that would say none of that matters because it's still red. And the reality is, if I do have red-green color blindness, what I'm still describing something to you, and we're using the word red to describe it, which is where nominalism comes in. But whatever I'm perceiving, I can't really describe it to you any other way because you're going to perceive it as red. And do we know, does anybody here have color blindness? Okay. Those of us who have normal color vision, do we know for a fact that what you see as red and what I see as red is the same thing? If some third external observer were able to take our eyes and project them onto screens and say, this is what red is, would it be necessarily the same?
That's a question I've wondered my whole life. Is blue blue to me as blue is to you?
But however blue is to you relates to the other colors in some way that's the same way that the colors relate to me, because we're talking about wavelengths. But for all I know, what you perceive as blue might be yellow to me. That would explain a lot. But the so let's use that example. Sure, if we take a wavelength of light and say we're looking at this bandwidth of light, and that's red within the visible spectrum. And you're seeing red and I'm seeing red because we're both having that spectrum of light impinge on our visual sensory, apparatus. We still don't know whether that's red the same way to you as it is to me. We just say it's red and we experience it as red. But a Martian with totally different sensory apparatus might say, I don't know what you're talking about other than that you use this word red. And I'm from the red planet, so I get to define what that is, okay? Now, Tom's asking an important question here, because the issue becomes, once you reject a realist perspective and it becomes about language and subjective perception, you can never close the circle. You just never can close the circle, because you will ultimately always say, well, that's the way you experience it. But she experiences it differently, which is why Locke, in trying to close the circle, spends so much time basically talking about a theory of knowledge and saying, how do we actually experience anything? He basically says that every human being, every human mind, is created as a tabula rasa, a clean slate. There are no innate ideas. There is no thing that is, this is all acquired. You just taught it. It's the nature versus nurture argument, right? And Locke is basically saying it's all nature. Nobody is born a certain way. Now, in our era, we've seen people spend multiples of billions of dollars to say, let's actually define the nature side of that equation better by sequencing the human genome and saying what genomic sequence is associated with this trait. Fair enough. But now people are saying what sequence of on the DNA is associated with this behavior or with this, Has anybody successfully said, here's the genetic component in a particular behavior yet? Not particularly. There are arguments around that. If you do, you could go find probably 100 different academic papers talking about specific genetic traits being associated with specific sexual behaviors or identity. But nobody's really closed that circle either. There's still a lot of work being done on that. But the nature versus nurture issue becomes where Locke tries to close that circle and doesn't quite. And so we see in our own day when Richard Dawkins is talking about everything being material and random, but we have what? Selfish genes, right? Which looks an awful like final causation in Aristotelian metaphysics, because it's saying something has a purpose. We've just had in this week a scientist claim to have altered the genomic sequence in human embryos, 2 twins in China, right? And he's basically said, I have changed their DNA in a way where they are resistant to HIV infection. I've engineered the human genome because these children are to be born to an uninfected mother from a father who's infected with HIV. So I'm going to make it where they can't get infected with HIV. Using those specific facts, it sounds quasi-appealing, But then when you start monkeying with DNA and saying we're going to design human beings, you start crossing certain pathways into the island of Dr. Moreau, right? So what's the difference between the scientist doing that and somebody saying, well, we'll see what happens with the babies? Human agency. You can't, without modern thought, sit there and say, how can we change this outcome? So let's play with Locke here a minute and see where he tries, okay? Locke, who's considered to be the father of the Enlightenment by many people, he sought to set definite limits on what is strictly knowable, particularly with respect to faith claims. There can be no certainty in claims of faith. We can have strongly held opinions. Now, remember when we started out, we talked about deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, right? And the thing about deductive reasoning, whether it was a syllogism or whatever else, was it led to certainty in result. And inductive reasoning, where we were gathering more data, led to probability in result. So we're seeing inductive reasoning come more to the fore here, clothed in the methodology of some deductive speculation. So Locke is saying we can't have certainty. Nothing is strictly knowable. You wouldn't label Locke as a skeptic, capital S, yet, but it's going to grow out of his thinking. The necessary corollary is a low epistemic footing for any faith claim. Remember when we talked about epistemic footing, low epistemic footing versus certainty. Epistemology is what? The philosophy of knowledge, how we can know things. So if I say something has a low epistemic footing, I'm saying it's more or less probable. Low footing would be less probable. So he's saying it's certainly possible that what you claim about, Jesus Christ and resurrection and an eternal soul is true, but you haven't proven anything because you haven't given me enough data, right? So if we set all faith claims on a low plane, all we can do with faith claims that compete with each other is tolerate them. Say, well, you could be right, so I'm not going to argue with you. We're just going to coexist. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Right? I mean, in the 21st century, you're not going to sit there and say, let's, go and engage in this crusade or whatever. You might say, what's wrong with this idea of toleration? Why would that be a problem? Yeah, we just got that last week, right. And so once you have a low epistemic status for a faith claim, the net result is theology becomes about process, not about conclusions. It's how we think about faith, not what we understand the faith to be. We're always seeking the truth and don't claim really to have found it. Now, this is the most popular sort of theology in the world today, right? Outside of Wahhabist Islam or something, and certain fundamentalist sects in Christianity and others, people aren't saying 100% certain, black or white, no deal. They're saying, well, this is the way I understand it. Jesus is our way to salvation, but there could be others, et cetera, right? So we take this as sort of the norm now. But this only arises in 1690 in terms of being written down by Locke, at any rate, in his essay on human understanding. This is a late development in the development of human thinking, the idea of religious tolerance. Because why would you not engage in religious tolerance, say, in 1290? Well, okay, right? Your life would be in danger, yeah. you're going to be sitting there and saying, I don't get to define what's true here. It's been revealed to me. And you might argue about the structure of the church and say whether it's been properly communicated with you. And so early efforts, the sort of morning star of the Protestant Reformation would be John Wycliffe, around 1348, translating the Bible into English and saying, we have to experience this in a language we can understand it so that we can test your claims about the faith in the church, right? And so we get the Wycliffe Black-Letter Bible and the Lollards and Lollardy arising in England. What's the response in England? Kill them, right. You know, so it's like, so that by the time the Protestant Reformation truly arises and you start seeing Henry VIII engaging with the translation of John Tyndall of the Bible into English, what does he do to John Tyndall? Kill him. Why? Because Lollardy is associated with challenges to crown authority, not church authority. This is a threat to the crown. That's why Tyndall gets executed at Wapping Dock, not because the church has issued any decree against him. It's the state that executes him. Henry VIII had what was called the Bishop's Bible set up, where that was then an official translation.
Before that, it was unofficial, and that's why.
Exactly. You don't have the right license to do this. And
Specifically because he didn't want to translate it into English, because he didn't authorize it, or the Crown didn't.
yeah, that would be a sort of a foreshortened account there. But yeah, it does result a lot from exercise of authority. So if we say that theology is process, the point here I'm trying to make is not whether religious toleration is good or bad. You can hold whatever opinion you want on that. This is not an issue of good or bad. The point is that the refutation of classical metaphysics never really happened. People just rejected it because they wanted to further the project of rejecting a classical worldview, or more specifically, a scholastic worldview, and that determined their arguments. Let's throw out this structure of authority because it's caused all this conflict, and therefore we have to think differently. Now, I'm going to go out on some thin ice here. In our own era, we live through a whole series of waves here that we call the culture wars. When was the last time in the culture wars, whether they're around sexuality or whether they're around some other aspect of an ism, that you heard anybody sit down and engage in reasoned argument about why you might be opposed to an innovation? If you were to argue against innovations in the church, for example, what would be the response? You're a hater. We don't have to engage your argument, because if you do not agree with this position, you're engaging in hate. That's what happens with scholasticism with the moderns. They take it and say, it's the past, it's caused us these problems, so we will not engage the arguments. We will define them as not being valid. That's what happens when the scholastic system gets thrown out in modern philosophy. Nobody sits there and says, here's where Aristotle was wrong and how he was wrong. Or here's where Aquinas is wrong and how he was wrong. They just say, that's not modern thinking. That's not scientific.
But as you said before, you can't use Aristotle's techniques to reject Aristotle's conclusions. So it would be a moot point for me to argue in that method, because it's self-defeating. There's
Yeah, well, I'm actually saying a little bit more than that, Tom. I'm not restricting this to methodology. Where methodology comes in is what I would call first principles. And so if the first principle is that something is real or it's not, that's where we run into the problem, whether we take a realist or a nominalist perspective. Once you reject realism, you cannot come up with an argument to a nominalist or a conceptualist or an empiricist or whatever ist we want to. You can't refute realism on that basis. And you can't refute realism on the basis of arguments from a realist perspective. So nobody's actually succeeded in doing this, whatever methodology they've tried to use, which posits at least the possibility that these first principles of logic are external to the human mind. They're just part of reality, part of an objective reality, the same way we would say if we believed that truth is objective, that it's objective. It's not your truth, it's my truth, it's whatever the truth is. And then we sit there and get into all kinds of arguments about God and saying, well, the truth has been revealed to us. We didn't get to define it.
There's no way to go about it because it's the first principle. They have to define it first. There's no other school of thought that would be able to, like a different school of thought can come first and define what truth was first.
If you say that they defined it, but none of the Greeks would argue they defined it. They would say they discovered it.
But that's just a nominalist.
Okay, all right. But okay. But the difference between defining and discovering, the conceptual difference, we're using another word there, is did it exist independent of the human mind? Now, let's look at another universal, numbers. Does it require, if the human mind had never existed, would the ratio of 3.1416 to 1 establish the ratio, would that change pi? Would pi cease to exist if there was no human mind to experience pi and eventually do enough measurement and enough inductive reasoning to say this is the ratio between the diameter of a circle and the circumference of the circle? It'd still be 3.1416, you know. Okay, suppose we used binary counting. I'm talking about the actual ratio. Yeah, the amount, as opposed to how we define numbers. Let's just call it pi. And would pi change or cease to exist or never have arisen, or there'd be no such relationship between the diameter of a circle and the circumference of a circle if there'd never been a human being? Once we got minds to play with that.
Once we got minds to play with it, now when we get to faith statements, that's a little bit different than pi.
Okay, I'm not getting to faith statements yet.
But that's what isn't that, I don't want to go jump forward, but isn't that what those people during the Reformation and during when they took that argument that yes, you can apply this to pi, but you can't.
You can't apply it to a statement of faith. Okay, fair enough. All right. My point in using pi as an example here is if we take pi as a representation, a symbol of first principles. When I say first principles, I'm not talking about Aristotelian methodology, but what they say, hey, here's how the world works. Here's the pi behind the world. If we take pi as an example, then for the moderns to say we have to take the classical metaphysics and throw them out because they're wrong, we'd have to be able to establish here are all the examples where there's a different ratio between diameter and circumference. And nobody's done that, right? And so they didn't do that with the arguments from classical metaphysics. They just said, we're not going to engage that. That's not what we define to be science. That's not what we define to be the way we will think about things. It keeps creeping back. Final causation, formal causation keeps creeping back into the things where in modern thinking we focus really only on material cause, right? And efficient cause, cause and effect. How are things made? What are they made out of? And we might say that the efficient cause is random. It's just that there are, gazillions of particles going around, they collide with each other, and things result. And, if we had, an infinite number of monkeys and typewriters, they'd produce all the works of William Shakespeare, right? The moderns don't sit there and say, when they discovered pi, they got it wrong. It's really a different ratio. Or they're different. It's not universal. Here are the examples where it's not universal. They just said, nope, not going to engage with that. And threw that system out. So now as we shift gears, we see that the rest of philosophy up to our day is always a struggle to try to close that circle somehow. And nobody succeeds in closing that circle. And so what we don't focus on is the conclusion. We focus on the process. All theology becomes process. How we think about God, not what's been revealed or what's been discovered. Yeah? And this makes us really uncomfortable as moderns and postmoderns because we're used to process thinking. That's the way we think. That's the way we've been trained, right? We don't use deductive reasoning in most thinking anymore. We just gather more data. And if now we're in the era of big data, right? And so if you gather enough data, you can kind of prove anything, right? And we have AIs playing with algorithms to say, well, the fact that you ordered this and the fact that you ordered that means I'm going to advertise this to you. Dale, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was feeling a little guilty about what I was doing because I heard the argument. My guilt has been assuaged.
You're guilty about what?
I don't feel guilty about bringing up what I was going to bring up. But you mentioned this several weeks ago about a secular age.
Oh, Taylor, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because Luther didn't pull the edifice down like Calvin said. You have to burn it. Here's like a ground. Burn, baby, burn. In the 60s. Because he's still using some of the same magic rituals, which is what this guy.
Well, if you read Luther's treatise on the Babylonian captivity of the church, at no point is he sitting there and saying, there is no such thing as a Christian church and it's all up to us as individuals, right? He's very much a churchman. He's saying, this is not the valid expression of the universal church. This has been corrupted and we need to reform it. Does Luther at any time think of himself as destroying the Christian church? No, he thinks of himself as reforming the Christian church and saying, here's how it's been corrupted and, is in the captivity of, Well, now, wait a minute. Let's use that example. One of Luther's arguments to focus on the dominical sacraments of Eucharist and baptism and say there are two sacraments rather than these other five. What's his problem with the other five? Okay, well, we call it...
Baptism and
Okay. Let's not get into doctrinal arguments here. I want to talk about history of doctrine. Yeah. If you read Luther on the sacraments, the reason he has a problem with the other five is the other five have been defined basically in the scholastic system, how we think about how God works. And whether it's Aquinas or Bonaventure, or, I'm sorry, what? Right, but of course, a lot of that tradition gets refined and described in scholastic theology, whether it's the Summas of Aquinas or anybody else. So once you sit there and say, that's been corrupted because it's not the Bible itself, then you say you have to take those five sacraments and put them to the side.
Weren't those sacraments done before Thomas Aquinas? So it's kind of like rationalizing after the fact. That's how.
But how are you going to engage with the arguments for those sacraments in 1519 or 1517? You're going to do that on the basis of here's how it's been defined by the Church. And so while Rabanus Maurus back in the 11th century has been arguing against a lot of what becomes Catholic doctrine, at least by the Lateran Council, he loses that argument, right? I mean, a lot of those things got debated early on, but as theology continued to progress in the scholastic system, the debates went away. And there were conciliar positions taken on things saying, no, this is a sacrament, and here's how it works, and here's what the form is, and here's what the matter is, and, you know. And we still have those arguments. For example, within the Catholic Church, you'd say there are 7 sacraments. How many are there in the Episcopal Church?
2 with 5 sacramental rites.
Yeah, and you would get another priest to say 7.
I would say 7.
Right, and how many are there in the Eastern?
Says,
How many are there in Eastern Orthodoxy? 22. Yeah. So it's like, you know, it depends on what you say a sacrament is sometimes, right? Okay, so there's a nominalist position. Once we put human agency into this, we say who gets to define it rather than what's being revealed. So, go into the middle of page 2 here. I said that the arguments are determined on the basis of agenda, right? Therefore, science becomes not the search for ultimate causes and meanings, but a means of increasing human utility and power through the mechanical arts. Francis Bacon. This is where the cult of technology starts, okay, which we've really taken a run with. Or you could go with René Descartes. Science is a means of making humans masters and possessors of nature. Now, Descartes did not think of himself as a non-Christian. Descartes did not think of himself as a heretic. Descartes did not think of himself, he thought of himself as a good Frenchman in, you know, a French Catholic system. However, if you sat there and said, human beings are masters and possessors of nature, and compared that to classical church teaching, say 1,000 years before, people would have thought you were nuts. They would have said, this is the way nature works, it's been revealed to us, and we're not in charge. Descartes is saying, Bacon is saying, yeah, we kind of are in charge, and so we have to figure out how to do this better. That's the goal of science. That's the goal of knowledge.
But now, if you go back to Genesis, I can't quote it exactly. The Lord said, be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth.
Right.
And he has given everybody reason. Now, my stance and the Lutheran instead of Christian stance is that after the fall, human will, free will, does not exist. And we can only do bad things unless we are enlightened by the Holy Spirit. However, in Genesis, we are to subdue the earth, not that we're
stewards rather than masters.
Yes. And the Lord has given us reason to investigate things and given us science to use for the good.
And in our postmodern world now, the arguments, many of which are based on sound science and lots of inductive reasoning, but at some point the arguments for a specifically green perspective take on the character of faith statements that are focused very much on that form of stewardship, or, in the more extreme cases, focus very much on the idea of mastery and how we have to protect the planet because we're in charge. So human agency is where human thought changes here in the modern era. How we think about human agency is what changes. Now, keep going with me here. The necessary corollaries of saying that science is about increasing human utility and mastery is utility replaces wisdom. What was wisdom before? Discerning what's being revealed to us by God. Okay, so utility replaces wisdom. Enjoying the body in this life replaces preparing the soul for the next life. Classical metaphysics are not scientific. God becomes, at best, a designer and a spectator with humans having mastery over themselves. That's modernism in a nutshell, those corollaries. Thinkers like Locke would take the classical or scholastic metaphysics and say, well, this just leads to dangerous dogmatism. That's why we just had a century and a half of warfare. Because they have to say that now. Because to accept Aristotelian categories, causation, actuality, potentiality, etc., leads one to admit that the entire Aristotelian system is rationally unavoidable. You can't reject first principles of thought and square the circle again. You can't close the circle. Which would lead us to contemplation of first principles instead of focusing on useful things and technology. So if we go back to Aristotelian metaphysics, we're going to say our focus isn't on useful things and technology. It's on what is the end, the highest end and purpose of mankind under the classical metaphysic view as expressed in scholasticism, to contemplate God's will. That's supposed to be what we've been created for in a classical worldview, to contemplate God's will and experience his blessing. Once we say, well, I want to define things, you have to reject classical metaphysics to say, we're in charge and here's what science is and here's how we're going to exercise mastery.
Is contemplating God's will, is that Aristotelian or is that Aquinas?
Well, both. Aristotle's view of God is very different from Thomas Aquinas's, but he would still say there is a divinity exterior to us and we need to react to the divinity. Nobody would call Aristotle a Christian, although certainly St. Augustine kind of baptizes him into Christian thinking. The moderns basically reject Aristotle's conclusions and therefore throw the methodology out with it. Which takes us to page 3. 1690, an essay concerning human understanding. What Locke is trying to do is refute rationalist or realist concepts of innate ideas. He wants to take that and throw it out and say, that's not real. That's book 1. He wants to discuss what ideas really are. And so he says, well, there could be simple ideas or complex ideas. And so a simple one would be red or sweet or round, and they're acquired passively. What's the first problem with that argument? Because a first-year student of philosophy can take John Locke's theory of knowledge and just demolish it without thinking too much about it. But nobody goes back and really examines it anymore because we like his conclusions. So what's the first problem with saying, well, there are these things called simple ideas, and they're red or they're sweet or they're round as examples, and they are passively acquired? To passively acquire something, what is required? It has to exist. Yeah, it has to exist. There has to be a thing like red or sweet or round, which takes us right back into realism. So this is a nominalist loop outside of realism back into realism. But then we get complex ideas such as numbers or cause and effect or abstract ideas or identity. And these require a distinction between primary qualities such as shape, motion, and arrangement of particles, and secondary qualities, powers to produce various sensations within us, like red or sweet. What's the problem with that argument? Make a real rational distinction for me there between what he's saying and material, efficient, formal, and final causation. If it has the power to produce a sensation within me, that looks a lot like final causation. If it is a complex idea that's something like, I don't know, a primary quality, a shape, a motion, or an arrangement of particles, does that not look like formal causation? What's the difference? Let's keep going. In Book 3, he talks about a theory of language. In Book 4, he starts theorizing about knowledge, intuition, mathematics, moral philosophy, natural philosophy, which is science, faith, and opinion. And so basically his theory rejects first principles of classical metaphysics, but then uses them to come to different conclusions, which is epistemological modesty coupled with toleration. Can't we all get along? And we like that. Locke's conclusions have been found congenial because we're not fighting quite so much anymore, at least in mainland Europe, over matters of religious doctrine. The net result is that nobody goes back and actually looks at Locke's arguments. He's just the father of the Enlightenment who brought us a new way of thinking, and he had a major effect on how people think. A lot of political theory that ends up in the Declaration of Independence goes back to John Locke. So I'm not saying that Locke was some evil, horrible guy, and an ogre and all. I'm just saying there was a change in human thought, and we never actually went back and said, what's really going on here? In our lives, we are experiencing many changes in human thinking about things we used to consider universals revealed to us, about marriage, for example. And nobody's going back and examining the thinking behind that, because if you try to, somebody will say, we're not going to argue about that. You're a hater. So we're seeing the same thing now that starts really getting going here in 1690. Why? Because people were ready for change. That's the basic reason. They were tired of doctrinal warfare. And so they were ready for something else that allowed people to get along. That was it. Now, that's all independent of whether how you get along is right or wrong and how you define that, whether it's an objective truth revealed by God or, that's all independent of that. I'm not saying that toleration is good or bad. I'm just saying, let's go back to first principles and say, how did we get there? We are struggling in our lives with sea changes in social mores. And let's leave aside issues of sexuality. Let's just talk about cohabitation, regardless of who you're cohabiting with, right? Is there really anybody in most non-fundamentalist Christian churches who's going to really worry about whether the person you're living with, you've been married in a sacramental marriage anymore? Are they going to exclude you and shun you? No, that's been defined to be a private matter. And the definition of your marital status or your status in cohabitation as a private matter is something that really has only happened in the last 50, 60 years in our lifetimes. Before that, if you lived with somebody without benefit of marriage, what was the net result? I'm in the process of rereading some old mystery novels right now by people like Raymond Chandler or Ross MacDonald. And the Ross MacDonald ones are set in California in the 1950s. In California. What happens when somebody is found in a hotel room with a woman who's not his wife?
She's taken out and stoned.
He's arrested. He's arrested under the laws of the state of California. So is she, but, it's like, we used to, actually have laws on the book. They're still on the books in a lot of states, and worry about that sort of stuff. Now, you can say it's a good thing we don't worry about that anymore. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is you are living in another revolutionary era of human thinking, which is basically Lockean thinking coming home to roost. To say, there is no such thing as certainty. It's your right versus her right, your truth versus his truth, and all we have to do is get along. And as long as we're Google and saying, do no evil, except spy on you, we'll all be fine. Because what is important? Technology to enable us to exercise human mastery so that we can change embryos, or so that, this 500 years later, or 400 some years later, this is where it's taken 4 centuries to blossom. And if you say just 1990 and go from there, this is where the thinking starts blossoming into true modernism. But now we've made it postmodernism, where we're taking and saying words don't have meanings either, right? And so you really make it really very subjective. Now, I had lunch recently with a very bright woman in her 20s who has engaged in a number of lifestyle choices that I would say, well, that's different, but, you sit there and say, I'm not going to challenge your choices. I want to talk about the metaphysics behind your choices, the reasons, right? And this is a well enough read individual that if you say metaphysics, he's going to get into a real argument with you. Her definition of freedom is a very current and common definition of freedom, which is that you exercise your individual will, and as long as you're not doing harm to anybody else, that's it. Nobody can in any way restrict your will. Your unfettered exercise of will is freedom. What would classical metaphysics have to say about that? Because it does have something to say about that. That's defined as slavery. It's defined as slavery in classical metaphysics because you are a slave to your passions. It's not that you get to make a choice. That's not freedom. True freedom is choosing well, which means there's a standard of choice that's external to you. Other than that, you're just a slave. And you're a slave to, the God of this world, or the God, whatever religious system you use, whether it's classical Greek thought or Christianity. It's like, well, you're just a slave at that point. So people were ready for change, and we're seeing the same thing now. Epistemological modesty necessitates skepticism. You can't reject certainty and not just say it's all relative. You can't. Leaving aside the more extreme examples of contingency found in skepticism, and we'll look at those going forward, theology becomes process theology. Nobody's anymore trying to define this is how God, reveals his will and what it is. They're just saying, how do we think about this? How do you experience this? How do you feel about this? We've talked before about the final argument in modern discourse being, well, I just feel. People really believe that's a valid argument, and within this system, it is. As long as everything is on the same low epistemic footing, how you feel does matter. As long as you don't hurt anybody else, right? Make an argument for me if we say that the unfettered exercise of the human will is freedom, and as long as I don't harm anybody else, that's okay. Make a reasoned argument for me against pederasty. Pedophilia. The only reasoned argument you can make from philosophical perspective there is to say, a child cannot consent. And so what we've made all our morality about, and what we endlessly litigate now, and try to come up with yet another code of conduct in this university or that university, is how is consent expressed? And does the person have what we define to be the legal capacity to consent? And we say a child doesn't have the capacity to consent to a sexual act, and therefore it's evil and illegal. And believe me, I agree with that. But consent becomes an exercise of human agency. You're just saying there's no real human agency here. Now, let's take that further. Suppose you were arrested for bestiality, and the law does not, yet at any rate, recognize an animal as a person. So there's no issue of consent here, is there? So make an argument to me why that's not just okay because you were expressing your human will. It's not a human will I agree with, but, it seems to work for you. You've declared a domestic partnership with it, Make the argument. You see how you start chasing your tail once you reject a rationalist worldview? They didn't defend it. They just tolerated it because of power structures. Plato did make an argument in Republic for a particular type of what he defined as love between an older man and boys, and was basically positing the idea of a bond of honor between them that would allow them to fight together and form particularly good armies. Well, yeah, Plato certainly predated Aristotle, but I think it's a bit strong to say people argued for Yeah, it becomes an exercise in power in a society like ancient Greece or Rome. So, for example, if you read the Satyricon by Petronius, the protagonists are always fighting over the same boys, right? And our concept of sexual identity in 21st century America is something that would be very foreign in ancient Rome. If a person happened to like young boys, he wouldn't view that as his identity. He'd view it as his behavior. And because of his legal status, his behavior might be tolerated. But you will not find an ancient Roman philosopher saying, we tolerate it because here's how it's virtuous. It's just we tolerate it because we don't get to exercise power over him this way. I'll give you a more extreme example. In Roman law, the pater familias, the head of the clan, had a concept known as mund, M-U-N-D. That's personal jurisdiction. And so if you're my clan and I'm the pater familias, you're within my mund, which means I have certain rights over you. And if you're my child and you have displeased me in a particular way, I could have you sold as a slave or I could have you killed. And no imperial court has any jurisdiction over me. It's just not an act that will be recognized by a court because it's not in their jurisdiction. It's in mine.
Is that based on the Aristotelian concept of the family, the love definition of those things that were broken down in the 21st century?
Quick answer is I don't know. How the Mund evolved culturally and how that relates to systems of thought, whether that was with relation to a specific philosophic school or whether it was just a cultural practice that grew and was tolerated on that basis. I don't know. Sir Frederick Maine would be your best resource in his book on ancient law, because he spends chapters on that. But
my question would be, is the Aristotelian knowledge that we're looking at for things like faith systems and defining the truth, is that been used in that same way to rationalize things that we now accept, which wasn't the case, or if we had gone differently, the power systems throughout history would have been used in a different way by others to say this is what the truth must be. So we look at the Greek philosophers and say, why? And the Muslim world, which was familiar with Greek philosophy, sees it differently.
well, we have lots of examples in history of the misuse of classical metaphysics. Human beings. And so let me give you an example. What's the classical misuse of classical metaphysics? Racism, right? What I do in looking at material and efficient and formal and final causation, if I want to practice a racist power structure, is I define you to not meet the criteria. Now, if I'm really honest, I sit there and have a problem sort of closing that circle. But, okay, I'll be further provocative. When do we get the concept of chattel slavery arising? Okay, but just historically. Okay. And when did that happen? In the modern era. Slavery was an ancient institution that one was born into that was a big deal, okay? About 25% of the Roman Empire were slaves. And, you could be made a slave by being taken a prisoner of war. You could be made a slave as a criminal penalty, but, you could theoretically get your freedom. You could, earn money. You could do lots of things. But the distinction between Carl and Dale, if Carl's a slave and Dale's a free man, is not something we're going to say is a material difference between Carl and Dale as human beings. It's just my status in life. There are certain strata that you fit into in life, and that's been defined for you. So human agency kind of got corrupted that way. When we see chattel slavery arise in the 17th century and we start, bringing Africans over, that's a modern way of thinking, because the way it gets justified is Africans are defined not to be human, not to possess rational souls. And so you take classical metaphysics, rational soul, and say, well, here's where that doesn't apply.
So they define it as non-human.
Right. And so if you take the Holocaust, anti-Semitism is as old as European civilization, as long as there were Jews around, right? But it's when you get highly efficient, scientific, technological exercise of mastery under modern thinking that it gets turned into the Holocaust. Before that, anti-Semitism might be expressed in terms of how you ghettoize people by exercising power. Might be expressed in a pogrom where you burn everybody in a particular town. Everybody goes nuts and Cossacks come in, or you set the ghetto on fire. To make it into an industrial complex and say, here's the plan and how we measure it, that requires modern thinking. I mean,
but it doesn't require modern thinking to be corrupt. It just requires modern thinking to be corrupt with technology. Could the ancients be looked at using their corruption in philosophical thinking as well? I mean, the one thing that we have in common is that human beings, with all their flaws, are the ones in charge.
mm-hmm.
How do we think? How do we use stuff? And not to be overly skeptical, but isn't that just the fatal flaw in all of this, that we as humans are not divine?
That would be argued from a classical Christian perspective to be original sin, that we decide we're in charge and that we don't test our actions versus...
We can't say, we think we're in charge. When we think, you'll never get in trouble. I say this to the students, you'll never get in trouble for not knowing. You'll only get in trouble for thinking you know and you're wrong.
Fair enough. Good statement. Good statement. Okay, and so once we think we know and exercise our authority, our power on that basis, then we've rejected testing our knowledge against an external standard. And we're going to argue all the time about what the external standard is, whether it's the Bible literally, or the Bible plus these conciliar directives, or the Bible plus these, we get into all kinds of arguments about that, and so we just exercise power to win those arguments. So the idea of human agency is where modernism takes off, and it can go in extreme forms like the Holocaust. But you could use classical metaphysics to justify, the Nuremberg laws by, those are passed by an elected legislature saying we define these people to not have these rights. Why? Because they're not people. That's how you do it. Whereas if you sat there and said it's not about process, it's about a natural law perspective, and the Nuremberg laws are void because they're evil. That's not a process approach. The U.S. Supreme Court in the 1930s, we think we have judicial debates now. In the 1930s, there was the whole struggle over what was called substantive due process. And it gets to the point in, I think, 37 or something, where the Supreme Court keeps knocking down and declaring unconstitutional Roosevelt's legislative initiatives under the New Deal. And Chief Justice Roberts, how's that for an echo in time, finally, and I forget the name of the case, he switches his vote and upholds the legislation, and the New York Times calls it the switch in time that saved 9. Because Roosevelt's solution to this is to say, pack the court. We're going to have 15 justices, and I'm going to appoint 6 more. There's nothing in the Constitution that says there are only 9. Substantive due process says we can invalidate this law that was properly passed by a properly elected legislature and enacted and signed by the president because we think it's wrong. That's what we do. Now, when I was in law school, substantive due process would be scoffed at. All due process now is procedural. You follow the right defined procedures. Substantive due process is back in a big way in the courts. Obergefell case is a particular example of substantive due process. The Supreme Court said the laws enacted by these states with properly elected legislatures approved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we're declaring void because we think they're wrong. We think that our interpretation of an evolving constitution is that you don't get to define a marriage this way. You don't. That's substantive due process. So you can take what you define to be right and wrong and say it's versus this standard or that standard and use it to exercise power all you want, and people have done that throughout history. What's happened in modern thinking is because we've said things aren't certain, we've made it all about process, but then substance comes back in through the back door. Because I get to say, I don't like that result of that election or that act, and so I'll define it to be, not consonant with my view of human freedom. If you go back to Justice Kennedy's opinion in, was it the Casey case? I forget. Planned Parenthood versus, that's the one where he's in 96 starts talking about, what is the purpose of human expression? Of what do we do as human beings? Why do we have human beings? And he makes a definition that says it's an expression of will, and therefore you can't restrict how I express my will. And you draw a straight line from that to Obergefell, and everybody did. That's how they made the arguments that got us to the Obergefell decision. Now, we're not making a legal argument here about Obergefell. I'm not making an argument about same-sex marriage. I'm making an argument about the thought process that lets you sit there and say, we're not going to look at things except from the expression of human agency. That's the revolution in modern thinking, which is why we spent a whole class talking about the revolution, so that when we start getting to next week, skepticism and materialism, we can say, what's the background here? What really changed? Fair enough? Well, I can see you're still doubtful. I don't expect to convince you. But I'm trying to... Huh? Okay, yeah. And what did Thomas define knowledge to be? Yeah. What did Thomas define knowledge to be? Direct experience. Direct experience. If I don't have direct experience of it, it's not real. Thomas is the patron saint of modernism in that way. And on that happy note, we have reached our limit without a break, so you've been very tolerant. So Taylor's argument that you draw a straight line from the 16th century to what we're doing now is kind of where we got here.